Well, it's now 10:30. Welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. And today we have the distinct honor and pleasure of having as our guest Carter Johnson. He's Dr. Carter Johnson, I should say. And he's the distinguished professor emeritus at South Dakota State University. And he's also the author of a book called Ecology of Prairie Landscapes. And he has a unique perspective because he's been in this climate change investigation business for quite a while. Not as long as I've been alive, but that's a long time, you know, in human terms anyway. But he has the distinction of actually having studied the subject, unlike many other pundits who just sort of dream about it and come up with things after a bad bowl of chili or something. But he's actually studied the subject. And so we'll have at least the opportunity to glean from him data, you know, data-based opinions and observations, and to be able to kind of get under the hood of this whole climate change thing. I will remind you that this is an interactive endeavor here. And so I'm hoping that you will be keeping track of questions that you have, because we will definitely have time for you to interact with Dr. Johnson and bring to the discussion things that you're interested in, questions that you have had, things that you feel need to be clarified or cleared up in your mind about what the heck is this climate change thing anyway. If you're one of the people who have questions like that, this is an opportunity to ask someone who actually has studied and is still studying and observing what is going on. So with that, Dr. Johnson, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Glad to be here.
Let's start off with who is Carter Johnson? Give us some,
like
really. Can you give us a little background, like where you grew up and how did you get into this whole climate change business?
I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Our family owned a retail business in hardware and sporting goods. So most of my growing up was in the hardware store and a little bit at home. But the store was the big thing. And so that was my first life. My first 18 to 20 years was the hardware store, sweeping floors, waiting on customers, unpacking boxes, pricing things, catching shoplifters, all these kinds of things that we had to do.
Exciting life.
But then I had to make a decision. Do I want to do this for the rest of my life and take over my dad's store? And I and my two brothers all came up with the same conclusion. No, we think it's the hours are not very good. So I went off to get my PhD, and another brother became a lawyer, and the other one became a doctor. So we didn't pick hardware. Anyway, so I graduated from Augustana College with a biology degree, went to North Dakota State with PhD in botany, plant ecology. My first job was at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, where I was first introduced to the climate change problem by looking at where carbon is in the biosphere. So where's all the carbon in terrestrial vegetation being stored? So we looked at tropical rainforests a lot, and we looked at the taiga in Siberia, where there's massive amounts of carbon, and mapped that. So we produced maps of where the carbon was. And that's important to know. It's one of the big pools. And if it stays where it is, that's fine. Or if it grows, it's fine. But if it begins to shrink, it means it goes more to the atmosphere, which is going to make even more warming. So I was at Oak Ridge for 6 years, moved on to Virginia Tech for 12 years in Blacksburg, Virginia. And then I decided, well, I think I want to go back to home place, and my relatives have lived here and some of the things I like to do in South Dakota. So I came back to South Dakota State in 1989, where I was department head for 6 years and then a faculty member and teacher for another 25, I guess. And then I retired about 4 or 5 years ago. The climate part came for me, I should say, I'm not a climatologist. Mm-hmm. I'm an ecologist. And ecologists are always the organism and the environment. And so the environment, being the climate, is studied by climatologists. They have a lot of ideas about what's going to happen in the future, and they've made a lot of calculations. The ecologists will take that information and then apply it to an ecosystem. Well, what's going to happen with a lake if the climate changes the way the climatologists think that it will change? And my interest was in water-based ecosystems. And so I focused on wetlands. You probably know we have millions of wetlands in the Dakotas, the legacy of our glaciation. And they're very important ecologically, high biodiversity, a lot of ecosystem services and so on. So they're very vulnerable to climate change. So I focused on that beginning in 1991. So I've been looking at that problem, published a lot on the subject up until very recently. So that's a little bit of my climate change history, but I have a lot of other things I could bring up, studying rivers and the effects of dams on the Missouri, the Platte, and other rivers in the West, which has been interesting work, and also restoration work. How do we restore damaged ecosystems? How do we go about it? Why do we want to do it? How successful can we be? So those three things, the climate change, the restoration, and the river work, pretty well define my 52 years of doing this.
Well, all of those things will certainly come in handy in this discussion today, because we want to really talk about not just what happened in terms of climate change and the causes, though those are important. They're kind of thumbnails in this discussion, because what I would like to see us get into is, what difference does it make in terms of what's going to happen as a result of this climate change? So looking at that, let's start with first just so we have a little background. What has been happening in the last, I guess we were talking before the program about since the Industrial Revolution, pre and post Industrial Revolution, and what kind of changes have been observed at the 50,000 foot view?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look, let's say globally, there was never much concern about climate change until probably the first data came out on the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere. CO2 was known as a greenhouse gas as early as about 1900. Chemists tested it out and realized, yes, if you put light beams through vessels with carbon dioxide in them, the temperature goes up. And so that capacity for CO2 to be a contributor towards the temperature of the Earth was very important. And it wasn't until about 1958, when the first monitoring was done, and it was done on Mauna Loa, Hawaii, on the top of a mountain. The measurements were made in 1958 and then continued on. And I think people wanted to know what the concentration was for sure, but they had no idea about how it was changing. And so after about 10 years, and they saw it bumping up every year. Every year it would go higher, higher, higher. It wasn't going to go up and go down and so on. It was just a steady rise because of the fact the internal combustion engine was found in more and more places, especially in automobiles. So that was the first clue that we had something to think about and possibly to worry about. But the climate wasn't warming back then. In the 1960s, the temperature of the earth really hadn't changed much over the last 10 to 20 to 30, 40, 50 years. So people said, well, maybe these guys are wrong and the CO2 thing really isn't going to be a big deal. But then the 80s arrived. And when the 80s arrived, the temperature went up. And all of a sudden, it was like it was being held back by something. And all of a sudden, it was released. The heat was released and up went the temperature. And so once we had the Mauna Loa data that showed it was keep going every year. In fact, the rate of the steepness of the curve was getting greater and greater and greater. And that was worrisome. But also when we found out that it was affecting, or at least the temperature was going up at the same time CO2 was going up, then we think we have really something to study. And so at that point, well, where I was, that the National Lab, they had monies they can move around and study whatever they wanted to on a short notice. So they could start working on climate change in the ivory tower back then, but it was not in the coffee houses. It was not in the coffee rooms. But in the 80s, it started moving into the coffee rooms and people started thinking, what in the world is going on here? And the science funding agencies like the National Science Foundation said, okay, let's start putting some money into this. This looks like a direction that we need to go. So the funding came into the 80s. And then the issue was, do we want to prevent climate change or do we want to adapt to climate change? Which of those two things? And that was the big message that was out and even in the public. Should we start shutting down our fossil fuel use? Or we're just so, okay, it's so important to have what we've got, so let's just accept, we'll just adapt. So we'll build seawalls if we need them, and so on. We'll take care of it that way, and we'll just sort of go along with it. And most people at the time said, well, we really need to do the right thing. Well, we all know now that we haven't done hardly anything. So the seawalls idea is really, the adaptation is where we're at, and we pretty well shut down the possibility for stopping this thing. Now, we could slow it, but we're not going to remove it as a factor in our life. So then it's built up into the point now where, as you know, with the IPCC and so on, there's research all over the world going into this, and it's now one of the lead articles in just about any public issues about science. So that's sort of a long view of the way I've seen it to develop over my research area. So,
well, let's talk then about the ecological impact of that. What kind of ecological impacts have you observed? I'm sure there are many, but if you can just give us some.
Well, I think the first thing is a principle. There's the principle of ecology, and this is because of people have been studying this for a couple of hundred years. Climate is the biggest driver of ecosystems. Of all the factors that come into play in the environment, including human impacts, climate is the biggest driver. When climate changes even seasonally or varies, like weather, it has an impact. And if it gets very cold, we get ice. We get ice here in South Dakota. We had glaciers that were almost 1,000 feet thick, right where I'm sitting. That was 15,000 years ago. Well, it only took 5 degrees centigrade colder for that to happen. So, and just the opposite can happen, of course. We can go to warm periods and see the reverse of that. The temperature in middle of South Dakota during the dinosaur days was pretty warm and wet and humid there. So we can go that kind of a wide sweep depending on big factors that affect the climate, but not CO2. Now it's CO2, But back then there was things like volcanoes. When the volcano was putting a lot of material in the air, that can have an effect. Or meteorites, we know about the meteorite explosions that killed the dinosaurs off. Continental drift. The continents used to all be close to each other. And as they moved away, that had a big impact on the ocean conditions, and the ocean conditions affect what happens on continents. So that's the principle that we go by. So when we know that we're changing the climate for the first time, humans are changing the climate, we know that we're changing ecosystems. And some respond very sensitively to that. Others are more resilient, depending on a whole bunch of other factors. And if we look at in the Dakotas, the water-based systems, probably wetlands, rivers, streams, are probably the most sensitive. And the work I've done on wetlands show that if we get a 4-degree centigrade rise in the temperature here over the next, during this century, that there'll be very dry wetlands to result from it. And the consequences for people are that wetlands are an important component of our life. They store water for people that have cattle that need to drink. They have high biodiversity. The hunters and fishermen are all concerned about how this might affect their livelihoods. And so in runoff of water that's captured by wetlands doesn't get to the stream, and then it's filtered before it gets to the stream. So if we don't have wetlands, or they're not functional wetlands, we've lost biodiversity and we've lost the function of these in our ecosystem. And so that's one example of where we see this happening. Now, the temperature in the Dakotas has only gone up about a 1.5 degrees or so, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 50 to 60 years. So it's not enough to have a grandiose effect, but there are.
You mean average temperature? Right?
Average temperature, yeah. Mm-hmm. And the forecasts would be with centigrade or with Fahrenheit would be about 7 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit would be what is expected now by the IPCC. That would be pretty dramatic. But just a degree or two is a little hard to see. But you can measure it. Water levels can change. And we're beginning to see now a drought effect. That could be a combination of temperature and different rainfall events. And we're seeing much more wild weather. We certainly saw the wild weather, a month ago with the 105-mile-an-hour winds. So there is that one. There's the one in Iowa a few years before. There was a dust storm in Montana you probably heard about with hundreds of vehicles stalled and deaths from people running into each other in the dark. It was during the day, I think, but it was a dark storm. So there are examples of what appear to be the impacts of climate change already, and particularly the variability and the wide-ranging. One year you get this, the next year you get something else. 1 month you get this and something else the next month. So the variability is certainly higher, and the temperature has gone up.
So,
yeah.
If I can just interrupt for a minute, when you talk about the change, and you mentioned earlier that's we're going along and seems like, well, that's not that big of a thing, and then suddenly everything changes. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm off base here, that nature has a lot of compensating mechanisms, and they compensate until they're overburdened. And then when those stop, then all bets are off then.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah. Wetlands have a certain resilience. You can lose some water and you still maintain most of the organisms in the system. But then if you get to a certain point, where it's nearly dry, then certain organisms can't live there, and so they die out in that area and can't come back until the water comes back. But the thing about resilience is that you need landscape resilience too. You can't just look at one pond, but you have to think, well, now, if the frogs die out in this pond because of low water in the natural system, they would come back when the water came back. How was that? Well, there are other ponds around that are a little deeper, and they survived there. Then they can spread back out again. Well, we're the great fragmenters of ecosystems, and we plow up all the prairie and leave a few isolated wetlands. But how are the frogs going to get from one wetland through a bunch of dry ones to another one? And so I like to think of, you know, our landscape, sort of landscape resilience rather than individual patches, and that we need to think about what we call the matrix, which is the land in between, as important for these species to come back. There has to be some way they can find their way back if they're going to maintain themselves after disturbances. Disturbances are typical. They're common in natural systems: lightning, fire, you know, bison herds going through the prairie and tearing it all up, rubbing rocks, all these things that go on. They're all disturbances to the system. But as you say, it has various ways: storing seeds, for example, storing moisture, for example, roots that go deep, all these things that allow it to come back after disturbances. But the humans have shortcut a lot of these things, and it makes it more difficult for this to happen.
You spoke also of sensitivity, and can you talk a little bit more about the sensitivity, how like minute changes or something like that will things
yeah, I think that maybe the best example would be looking at a mountain, and the mountain, let's say something in the Rockies, that the base of the mountain is at maybe what 5,000 feet, but the peak is 14,000 feet. And when you go to the Rockies and you drive up, you see these zones of vegetation. So the trees at the first zone at the bottom, where it's much warmer, are one group. Maybe it's something like pine. But as you go up, they get to be more like spruce and aspen. And eventually you get to a place where the trees can't grow at all. And you find that the tundra prairie, or the tundra species that grow close to the ground. And so and that's a climate controlled system.
Kind of like my head, right? I mean, it's got this, then you get to the top and there's no.
I'm not going to go there, Lawrence. Yeah, we all have our time, don't we? It's so
the
far
tree line.
hanging in there, but it's a climate control boundaries. There are climate control. So let's say it warms up by a couple degrees, and that means that some plants it's going to be a little bit too warm for them, and so they're gonna have to go up, migrate up in the mountain. And so what happens is their progeny that reproduces some distance to the upslope survives, and the ones that do with the south to where they are now or below die out, and the whole zone shifts. And so, and it's fairly sensitive. I mean, people are worried that the tundra right now, which is quite rich and diverse on the very tops of the mountains, is going to be gone. It's going to be taken over by forest, and there'll be no places for the hundreds of little cushion plants that grow in the alpine tundra. And so that's the huge biodiversity loss because of that. So that's maybe one example of the sensitivity problem.
I want to open it up now to our esteemed panel here. If there are any questions from you folks, or comments, observations, things that you want to see or talk about. Well, while you're pondering it, we'll continue. we talked a little bit about the kind of the history where we've come from. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now. We're seeing all kinds of news about climate change.
Mhm.
What's going on now?
Well, I think what's going on is the climate is showing more of itself than it showed 10 to 20 to 30 years ago. So we're beginning to see more evidence that the climate is changing. And the evidence we look for is higher frequencies of certain events that might be relatively damaging, and also the appearance of things that we've never seen before, at least in our modern, since humans have been here in North America. Things that are obviously rare and are becoming more common. And so those things are beginning to show up. And you see the Weather Channel showing, well, these are the records, for all these cities, the temperature records for either this day or this month or this year. And oftentimes, almost always, everything's warmer. So records are being broken that are about 150 years old. And the record in England was much older than 150 years old. The one where they got just a few days ago, the highest temperature ever recorded in England, which I believe was 106 or 107 degrees. And I think that goes way back. I'm sure they had thermometers around, in 16, 1700s, and nobody had recorded anything like that before. So that, when you begin to see those, you know that something's up.
Well, a lot of the news has focused, of course, on the United States because we live here,
Mm-hmm.
and Europe. But what I am not hearing is what's happening in Africa, where that's not, those temperatures were kind of normal in some places. But what's happening there in terms of climate change?
I can't really give you any specifics, but I could say this, that it is variable. Some places are going to have more change than others. And Africa, of course, is half in the northern hemisphere and half in the southern hemisphere.
Sure.
And so there is the impacts of climate change are going to be higher as you move from the equator to the poles. So the people at the equator are expected to see less change than they'll see to the north or south. And that's because of the white ice and snowpack near the poles, which cools those portions of the earth, which we don't have, of course, in Africa, except on some of the very highest mountains.
Mhm.
So that, I would say, they might be escaping some of the more severe, but go to Australia, and even though that is close to the equator, the northern portion, Australia is on fire.
Mhm.
And as I've been reading things over the years, Australia was always sort of going to be the poster child of climate change, in part because it's such a dry, arid place by and large. It's sort of on the edge, of being able to inhabit places or get any agriculture going. It's mostly desert in the interior of Australia. So they were more vulnerable from that standpoint, and it's showing up. And they're having major fires in Australia. Losses of biodiversity, species are going extinct. But that's what I would say. And as you go looking in North America, probably as we go farther north, and especially into Canada and to Alaska, that's where we're going to see more impacts of more changes. Now, some people say, well, that's not so bad because it's pretty cold in Canada. Our farming isn't very good, and this a little bit warmer is going to be better for us. And of course, it's probably going to be that way. There will be some places in the earth that are not very habitable now that will be habitable in the future. And so somebody says, well, that's a good thing. But I'm afraid if you list the good things and look at the bad things, the list of bad things is quite a bit longer than the
Yes.
good things.
Yeah. And
Otherwise, we
also,
wouldn't worry about it.
yeah, well, the interesting thing is too, often people judge what's good or bad about climate change based on just humans, as though we're the only
Oh,
organisms
yeah.
and that we're isolated from all the other ones, and
That's
that there is no cascading effect by, and loop. One would say, some would say karma, about, the things that are happening to all of those other species.
very, very true. And there are going to be a lot of extinctions when this all begins to develop more. No question about that. And also with your comment about people judging whether climate change is going to be good or bad. People in the Great Plains might say, well, a little bit warmer and less of the snow in the winter and all that's going to be better. Not thinking about the coast, where we're going to have, a few more feet for sure of sea level. So, you can't exactly, your world has to be bigger than just around your farm.
Yes. Yeah.
If we're to get through this, and thinking about the whole system as somewhat interdependent is very important.
Well, the other thing is, a lot of people here, they like the space that we have here.
Mhm.
And where do you think all those East Coast people are going to come when the sea level starts rising? That's the end of that.
Well, and the winters will be a little milder. The forecasts are for somewhat milder winters. However, I think there could be a storminess component to it. So we could have overall maybe less snow, but we might have more big events, not too many events, but more big events. And so, it might be some trade-offs there. But yeah, I think they might. I think my wife has always said that people are going to be, we moved here in part because we're from here and we do like the space. And she said, well, that people are going to be, and we lived in the East for a long time, and they're going to be coming, and when the sea level rises and people have to leave and so on, and you're looking for a place to go, they might be here. And I said, well, but there's still that, minus 30 every once in a while in the wintertime. That might have some effect on how long they stay.
That's right. All the people who can swim will stay there, and then the ones who can't, they come here, right?
Well, there's already pumps in Miami.
Yes.
Pumping water out of the groundwater that's seeping in from higher ocean levels already. So it's beginning to start already. And some farms are already getting groundwater that's brackish.
Sure. They might want to study in Amsterdam for a few years, send all their kids to.
There you go. Yeah, they know something about the sea, don't they?
Exactly. Yeah. Now, James Stengel, did you want to come on and ask your question live, or should we read it? Because James had a question in the chat, but he might want to discuss it. But he had a question.
No, I'd rather just you guys read it.
Okay. All right. So he says, our universities have turned out great and competent biologists, ecologists, scientists for decades, and many of us end up working for federal, state, NGO, teachers, etc. But we seem to have missed the boat politically. How can we fix this?
Yeah, it's
a trick question.
Yeah, well, really, it's current, but it's also an old question. My whole career, I've been urged as a scientist to communicate more with people that are not scientists, and so I do publish a lot in popular sources that people have access to, and so I've tried to do that, and I think that's one way that we can help out here to educate people at that level. Or in classes, I've taught classes that climate change was one of the components of it, and I've had students come to me and say, well, I thought climate change was a joke, because that's sort of what I hear. I took classes and I did the readings that you suggested, and we talked about the things we know and the things we don't know. And I'm really worried. I think this is a serious thing. And so there is that internal education that we try to educate people when they leave, that they carry that with them. But also there's getting the professor off the lectern and out into the coffee shop.
Thank you.
And my work on wetlands and with waterfowl is where I've spent a lot of time with people that are certainly not scientists, but they like to hunt ducks.
Yeah.
And then we got to talk about the duck situation or other organisms, the other birds that use wetlands that are going to be in trouble. So I've tried to do that, but your question, the question, James, is a good one. How do we get good information out into the public? And some people are good at it. Some people are not good at it. We always need to do better. I don't know of any other mechanisms. There's certainly a lot of press mechanisms. I mean, they're almost all of the, National Geographic and those sorts of magazines, they all have climate change sections. I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
I really do want to applaud you as a scientist for getting out and talking to the public. I think if there's one area where science has failed miserably,
Mhm.
and that is translating what we know and don't know to the general public. And I would say if there's one area where the schools in general, K-12, have failed miserably, is in teaching critical thinking so that their people are prepared to understand
Boy.
and can do something more than one ingredient cooking, so to speak. I mean,
Yeah, you're right about that. I've said many times that with my students, and I guess people in general that are not science-based and go through scientific methods, and how do we learn something? How do we find what's true and what's not true as scientists? And a lot of people don't know that process, but I've tried to go through that process with people. Is what does it take? Well, it takes experimentation, it takes reviews, it takes collegial evaluations, and all of these kinds of things. And but it isn't easy to get through and to get through to everybody. But I think maybe it's coming around now with climate change. But whatever the thing that happened with climate change, I think, and one party decided it was a joke and the other party thought it was important. Now, if it had been the Democrats that thought it was a joke, I would be every bit as mad at the Democrats as I am at the Republicans. But when you have two parties and one of them says it's a joke and the other says it's not, you're not going to get anything done. So we've had a stalemate for all this time in our political world. Hardly anything has been done to sort of alleviate the climate change problem. So I don't know how you deal with that, except to think about voting for different people. But maybe there's not much out. Maybe there aren't many out there to vote for. And I'm not a politician for sure.
But I think though that your answer actually does get to the solution, and that is we start talking to people, because at least so far, some people are trying to change it, but so far, people are the basis for the politics, and the leaders, in air quotes, are actually followers. And so if you really want to make political change, you got to change the minds of your neighbors and friends and family, and then have those people vote for different people.
Yeah, right.
And so those people who are ignoring this, they kind of fade into the sunset or something, but they become less relevant than they are today.
Sometimes I wonder if people that are scientists that go through the scientific method and so on, if they are so intellectually they're so different than people that don't do that, that they can't, maybe they can't even be effective in communicating with people that don't have a science background. So are there other people that would be intermediaries there that would be, could maybe couch it differently than we're able to do? And I do know that when I talk to people, to the public, I find that when somebody asks me, well, why is this happening? And I say, well, because of this. But then I say, but there's another factor, and that's this. And they hang in there on the first one, but the
Yeah.
second one, they don't. There's two things to deal with, and they're not used to that.
I call it 3+ recipe cooking. You know, it's like if you give people two ingredient,
Yeah.
they feel they can do it. You give them the third one, and then you get people dropping off. By the time you get to the fifth one, they feel like they can't do it, even though it's almost like the cattle guards, where the cattle think that they can't get it, and so they can't, but they really can do it. It's just that they think that they can't. And I watched that play out, where you lead people by the hand and said, watch this, pay attention to this. And now when they look back, they can't figure out, well, why did I think that was so hard? You know? So I think I was gonna say, I think it gets to, yes, we do need that. And we are getting it. There are some people who are trying it, but I think that in our training as scientists, one of the things that doesn't happen is we don't get that required subject of public communication, so that, as Einstein said, if you can't explain this to your grandma, you probably don't know it. You know?
Yeah, that's very true. But I do wonder sometimes if, you know, when I came to South Dakota, and I grew up here, but when I came here, and I interact with rural people a lot, because we're always wanting to go on their farms or their forests or their prairies and study or something, and we ask permission for that. And I find out that, oh yeah, they went to school at SDSU, and oh yeah, come on out, and they want to know what you're finding out, let us know. And that was the way it was when I was doing a lot of that kind of work 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I've noticed now they don't want to know, and they don't want anybody there, and they're not interested in what you're interested in. And things have changed. And I remember a book being written called The Death of Expertise. And I thought, I mean, if I don't know something about something that's important, but I don't know much about it, I would probably rely on somebody to tell me that knows it, that studied it, that's thought about it. So maybe the average citizen doesn't have a science background. Wouldn't they normally find somebody that they could trust to give them the information? Because they may themselves may not want to even get into it that far. But now it seems like there's a division, and the expertise is not valued. And so you have people that they just don't see eye to eye, because they won't cross that boundary. And I don't know how to correct that, and I don't know if maybe it's short-lived.
Well, I think it's kind of like, if you introduce it as science, then almost there's a rejection to it, as a knee-jerk rejection. But because people have been made to feel like somehow they're less than if they don't get the scientific thing right away.
Yeah.
But I think, and so their sense of self-esteem is attached. But I think when you can show them something that is completely maybe disconnected from the science, but they learn how little by little to process things and to be unafraid of asking questions, then I think you have made a fertile ground to have the conversations that we want to have. But lacking that, I see a lot of resistance.
Yeah, it's a difficult time right now, and we would like our scientists to convince everybody that's non-scientists that the science has something to offer. And if we don't plan based on knowledge from science, then we're probably going to regret it in the future. And if that principle would hold, then we're going to do along fine. But if scientists are questioned and under suspicion for taking a position on things, which is exactly why we have the scientific method, right?
That's right. That's the whole point of science, is to
Try to
question.
follow that the best we can, and I think
Exactly.
basically we do. But so yeah, it's an interesting predicament right now. But
Well, that said, I would like, anyone have any questions? Betty?
Yes, thank you. Professor, I have really been hooked into listening to you this morning, and what Lawrence just brought up about people who are, they'll tune out because they don't know anything about science and they don't even want to. I was a star pupil of that, non-pupil, if you will, until I started to hear people say and point out to me that nearly everything I was doing in my everyday life and to make a living involved science. I didn't think of it that way. I did a lot of cooking and baking. I was teaching people about nutrition. I was taking people's blood out of their fingers to see whether they were anemic. So we have been raised to not be, especially as a female, and thank goodness women are now scientists all over the place.
oh, yeah.
But it was one of those biases that was built into our educational and everyday life systems here. So I'm making some notes, and I hope that I can facilitate in some way having you or someone, I don't think there is anyone your equal around that I know of, but maybe there is, someone present publicly up here in Aberdeen. Get some people out, maybe they came for the cookies, but we just have to bring this down to where people don't necessarily even know it's science until they start talking about the recipes and how many ingredients they combine and what happens if you leave the vinegar out of the recipe that calls for activating the baking soda.
You never want to leave the vinegar out. That's a road to perdition right
Flat
there.
right there.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this very good
Well,
discussion.
that's a good point. I mean, I think you can argue that the advances that our country has made in our lifestyle and our wealth in the broad sense, and our knowledge is based on the knowledge that we've gained, a lot of it through science. And without that, we don't have our North Star to look to guide us, because it is the humans have, once the science got started in the human condition, it really changed a lot of things much for the better. Not that we don't have problems still, of course, but I think it's I mean, we went to the moon, right?
It seemed like when religion came into it, they wanted to get rid of the science, although they came from science, as I understand it. I mean, I don't understand it, but
Yeah.
they do not contradict each other necessarily.
No,
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 you
I
know?
don't think so. No, that's a very good point. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Todd, did you have something you wanted to add?
I had a question. Professor, obviously, I mean, what you're talking to is that like policy questions dealing with climate change tend to get stuck in the mud. And actually, a lot of things seem to get stuck in the mud these days until there's a kind of tipping point.
Mhm.
You've thought about this issue for a long time.
Mhm.
What do you think would be the tipping point that would force people to come and have to look at the science? And beyond that, just for solution's sake,
Mhm.
like to say, wow, we really have to.
Mhm.
I know you talk about water. I'm sure that's high on the list,
Mhm.
but I really would like to hear what, someone who's studied it for a long time thinks would be that kind of thing that would be so evident, such a pinch point that we would have to take it seriously.
Two things. One, I think sea level rise affects the most people in the world. and it affects every continent. So it's a universal problem that cannot be solved except by slowing our fossil fuel use. So that one, when you start beginning to see they're buying pumps in Miami and farmers are getting flooded out in Maryland and Chesapeake Bay area, then I think people would begin to notice that. The other thing I think would be agriculture. We need to grow food to stay alive here, and I can tell you something rather scary. I was shocked by this, and I still almost awake at night thinking about this. I'm doing another study on wetlands, and to do so, we project what the next, what the weather's going to be, what the climate's going to be in the rest of this century. And then we use those numbers, and these are all from global circulation models. These are all the models and the projections that the whole world is using. So they're very well researched, but they still are projections. They're not, nobody knows exactly what it's going to be in 2053. But we did summarize the worst case scenarios just the other day for our region. And I couldn't believe it, but there were temperatures in 3-day periods forecasts now of 140 degrees. Now, Death Valley didn't even quite get that hot. And this would be about maybe 20, almost 2100. And I thought to myself, my goodness, that's a 6 to 8 degrees centigrade rise for that to happen. And there wouldn't be any wetlands, there wouldn't be much in the rivers, the lakes would be low, there wouldn't be crops that we grow now, and the crop thing would have to be serious. So we're going to be looking, what we do is we take those numbers and we put them into a numerical model that shows us what would happen to water levels and wetlands with these temperatures and moisture. And so I think pointing out to people what those forecasts are and thinking of, would you want to be here at 140 degrees? Now, maybe these guys would, if you ask the climatologist, say, well, that might be an outlier. Okay, it's only 136. Those are intolerable temperatures.
Yeah.
For anything that we do now. We can't live except in air-conditioned buildings for all of our life.
And we depend on hydroelectric to run the
Exactly.
air conditioners.
And if all the snow melted in the Rockies in February, there wouldn't be much to supply the river in June, July, and August. So this is, I don't know. I think those numbers have not been publicized very much, and a lot of scientists have used them just to, well, this is the future, but they've never said, well, how warm are they projecting it to be? And so I think agriculture and coastal flooding would be where that you can get more takers to seriously consider climate change, even if you don't live along the coast. You do depend on the ships coming to the coast to supply things that you need, or even if you do live on the coast, you need to think about the Great Plains and the crop production that we have now, and how that's not going to be very good. So I think that's what I would think about.
I'd like to, in our last few minutes here, because we're coming down into the home stretch here, talk about solutions. I like solutions, even when they're difficult choices. What can we do in the short and long term to cope with the climate change? As you said, what's here is here now. We're not going to turn on a dime and get 9-cent change on this.
Right.
But the short term, what can we do? And then long-term, what can we do?
Well, I think we've started on one thing that's good. The IPCC, Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, it's the United Nations program. If just the US does things, or just if Europe does things, it's not going to change the global numbers very much. So we have to, first thing would be to whatever is done needs to be done throughout the earth as best we can do it. Otherwise, I mean, we might have a perfect thing here, but the CO2 coming from different places will eventually get to us, and so it won't help. We don't have our own environment, our own sky space. It all mixes together. So, but that would be number one, and that's not short term, right? That's long term. Short term is that the main source of CO2 to the atmosphere is burning of fossil fuel, and burning it to generate electricity in big power plants is where most of it comes from, and that's from coal and from oil. And Biden's been trying to do a few things with coal and shutting down some of these plants, and that's the main thing. But you got to replace it with something, and so it's got to be wind or solar. They are talking about coastal development of wind generation on the East Coast now, and even in the Gulf of Mexico, which would be a good thing. But we've got to start shutting down our CO2 to the atmosphere. Now, secondly, would be automobiles. Once you fixed up once we're getting our electricity from solar, then you got to worry about the cars. Well, the cars need to be electric, of course. I happen to have one, and they're amazing. I mean, I know that's where we're headed, for all sorts of other reasons besides them potentially using solar power to use it for the gas of that kind of car. So there are early adopters, the people who are trying to get off the grid and trying to generate their own electricity from solar on their house. That's a good thing. Electric cars are a good thing. There's limitations, of course, but those would be the three levels. Is international, slow the CO2 loss or inputs from electrical generation, and then our automobile situation would be number three. And some of those would be, I mean, you can go down and buy an electric car tomorrow, so that could be a short-term sort of solution. It's not a solution for the earth, but it is for you. And you can start thinking about doing more things like that would be helpful. So I never discourage people from doing things on their own that they know will help a little bit, because altogether that could be significant. But we can't just do that and just let our burning of coal and fossil fuel continue. That's where we're hurting the most. So that would be my.
What would be the impact of a massive tree reforestation? I just drove back from the West Coast, looking at what's happening in between here and there, and there's a lot of deforestation, and I'm wondering what could be the effect of a concerted worldwide effort to just reforest what we've unforested.
Well, that was my first job, was looking at where the carbon is globally in terrestrial vegetation, and so it was mostly in Siberia and in the tropical rainforests, in the natural systems. You're suggesting maybe we plant trees where either they were removed or where they never existed. Maybe afforestation is good.
Yeah, I would first look at the things we messed up.
Yeah.
How about, and if somebody cuts a tree, they can only cut it if they plant more trees.
Yeah. I would say that first I would protect the areas of the globe now that store massive amounts of carbon, tropical rainforests and the Amazon. We know about what's going on down there. They keep chipping away at it. And Siberia keeps having more fires. Well, fires release a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. So I would say in the tree world, let's make sure those places are maybe expanding rather than contracting or being disappearing altogether, because it's those store massive amounts of carbon. All the peat in Siberia and all the trees and other vegetation is an amazing amount of carbon. But a forest fire takes most of it and puts it in the atmosphere.
Yes.
So that would be, then the second thing would be planting trees, maybe even having a few in your yard, or having an area in town where you want to plant 5 acres and say we're storing carbon, because trees do store a lot of carbon. There are difficulties with, you can't just plant a tree and leave it. Now, unless it's in a natural situation. Somebody may have to first plant it and to water it, and then to water it for a while, maybe a few years. And then maybe there are diseases, and so they have to be taken care of. So
All right.
I think we normally think, well, let's plant a tree and then it'll just sort of do a job for us. But there's a lot of care involved. So there would be a care capacity that would have to be added. But there's no question that there's a lot of carbon stored in trees. But I would take that after I had improved the expansion of natural forest, then I would focus more on what we might call a human forest or a man-made forest. But you're right about the fact that you can store carbon that way.
Well, we've actually run out of time. And
Oh.
it's been a great discussion. It goes so fast when we have such guests as yourself. And I would like everyone to tune in next week, same time, same station, and we'll continue brainstorming the human connection. Thank you again, Carter Johnson, for being our guest.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it a lot.